Okay. I'd like to welcome you to this second event of the Australian Jewish Democratic Society for this year, in which there is a conversation between Larry Stillman and Rachel Shabi. And I will say something about Rachel in a few minutes. But before we get started, I'd like to ask Bonnie Gelman to give an acknowledgement of country, please.
I'm here on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, lands that are unceded, where connection to land, water, and sky are ongoing.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'm just admitting people as they turn up in the waiting room. Rachel Shabi is a British Israeli journalist and author, born in Israel to Iraqi parents in Ramat Gan, and she grew up in the UK, studied politics and literature at the University of Edinburgh. She's a contributing writer to The Guardian and the author of Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands, and some other books as well. Today, she will be having a conversation with Larry, and I invite Larry to start the conversation. Thank you very much, Rachel and Larry.
Thanks a lot, Harold. First, Rachel, can you just tell us a little about yourself? But you'll need to turn your mic on.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak. It's really nice to be with you all. I am a journalist. I was based in the region for a while, reporting on Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, primarily for The Guardian, but also for a bunch of other publications. And then I reported more widely during the period of the Arab uprisings from Egypt and Tunisia. And then since then, basically, I've been back and forth, but mostly in the UK, writing about and commentating in broadcast media on current affairs, which, in the UK, there were the Brexit years. So that was delightful. I spent a bit of time essentially filing pieces to American editors who wanted to know what the hell was going on. And I also wrote a lot about the years when Jeremy Corbyn was the socialist leader of the Labour Party. And so that's how I got essentially dragged into what became known as an anti-Semitism crisis with the then Labour leader. And that was really the origin story of putting together my latest book, Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism, which tries to untangle this sort of very convoluted, ugly, divisive, and distorted conversation we've been having about anti-Semitism in the political media space, certainly in the UK and across Europe and in the US, and I suspect is being mirrored in Australia as well. We'll get to that. And just how the end result of that is less understanding of anti-Semitism, more confusion and more division. So I try to counter all of those things.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. So we're all aware of the horrors of Gaza and the disastrous path that Israel has undertaken after October the 7th, despite what Hamas did, obviously. And you, like many, strongly oppose what Israel has done. But you also argue, and you've sort of already stated, that there's an influential and negative view of not just Israel and Zionism, but disturbingly, it comes out about Jews in general, in elements of the left. So I want to ask you, why is the Jewish question such a difficult one?
Well, I think the issue we have here is that there's just a lot of misunderstanding over what anti-Semitism actually is and how it manifests in the contemporary context. Essentially, in broad brushstrokes, the fight against anti-Semitism has been disconnected from the wider struggle against racism. I'm not saying that's happened for malign reasons, and we can talk about the reasons, but the end result is there's a disconnect. There's a inability to see anti-Semitism as the same, or not the same racism, but a one of a family of racisms, if you like. And we're just in societies across the West that have very low literacy around anti-Semitism, how it shows up, what it means. And at the same time, we have very forceful narrative taking hold across politics and media spaces that anti-Semitism is equivalent to anti-Zionism or to criticism of Israel. And so those two factors combined have created just this quagmire, this messiness, where it's very difficult to have good faith conversations about anti-Semitism that actually produce more understanding and more solidarity across a generalized fight against racism.
But Rachel, aren't we just whining in some respects that Jews by and large have much more power and influence than other groups? And it's really, at the moment, it's about Palestine. It's not about Jews. And I think that that's an argument that comes through in some elements of the left, that it's used as that the accusation of anti-Semitism is used as a diversion from really dealing with the issue of the oppression of Palestinians.
Well, I think that's a very zero-sum frame. And it's a frame that you can see how people arrive to, because our political and media conversation about anti-Semitism currently is primarily about trying to silence people crying out for the slaughter in Gaza to stop. And so that being the case, it is perceived as a distraction. The reality is that we can't fall into those sort of right-wing frames of either or. We have to tackle all of these things collectively. And at the same time, that's not to suggest there's a current equivalence between the two, but we can't, as progressives, have an argument where we are falling into the same zero-sum narratives of the far right. We can't be leaving anyone behind, right? Because that's not how you create a wide, broad, progressive movement that can actually counter both far-right politics more widely and the current situation and the horrifying Israeli assault on Gaza.
What about anti-Zionists, Jewish anti-Zionists, who take a position that there is a distinction between Judaism, Jews, and Zionism? And they're quite affirmative in that, or assertive, that there is a distinction between the two, between Judaism as a religion and Zionism as a political movement. Are they on the right track there?
Well, I think I just want to rewind or pan more widely for a second, which is just to say that these questions that you're asking are all part of a conversation and that's the reason why it's so confusing and convoluted, because there are so many different strands to this question and some of them contradict each other. So what I try to do in the book is look at why the subject of anti-Semitism, particularly in progressive spaces, has become so gnarled up and convoluted. And so to do that, there's a couple of chapters looking at things that are challenging within progressive spaces. There's a couple of chapters that look at Israel-Palestine itself. including the way that anti-Semitism has been mobilized politically in the supposed defense of Israel. And then there's a couple of chapters on the far right, because actually the alarming thing is that the far right is using both anti-Semitism and a pretend fight against it, a pretend defense of Jewish people, to shore up its own political fortunes. And all of these things are happening all at the same time. And so the book tries to look at each of these specific strands that are part of this knotty mess. And when it comes to the question of Zionism, I mean, it is just the reality that, especially in the post-World War era, and more markedly post the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, it's just been the reality that Jews in the diaspora have bound their association or connections to Israel in such a way that Jewish identity and support for Israel are seen as one and the same thing. Israel is a part of Jewish identity. And, you know, I have to say that for my family who are Israeli and who arrived in the UK in the 70s, that was kind of weird to see, you know, this whole thing of, well, why are you British Jews going on about Israel and support for Israel and, you know, defending Israel more than we, the actual Israelis, are doing. So that's just been the reality in the diaspora, that's happened. And I think that's a real fragmentation point at the moment, certainly in the UK, the figures track in the US. There has been a rapid polarization and fragmentation within the British Jewish community over Gaza. It's something that's been happening for some time because of the sort of mainstream communal body's support for an Israel that has plunged further and further towards the right. But certainly the war on Gaza and the moral failure of this moment has accelerated this fragmentation, and that is borne out in the stats that we see.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that letter that came to the Board of Jewish Deputies from, I think, 36 members who are now, I believe, are being sent to the headmaster's study, to use a British analogy, and being roundly caned for speaking out. Do you want to talk about that, and to what degree are they reflective of dissension, or is it really, you know, whining on the left, you might say, or are these mostly actually Zionistly oriented Jews, whatever Zionism mean, or what's going on in terms of representation and fragmentation and so on in the UK?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. It's something I just did a long piece about for New Lines magazine. It's coming out this week. So I had a sort of deep dive into the subject and spoke with a lot of people. The top line is that there were 36, a rebel 36, who are members of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the largest and oldest representative body of Jewish people in Britain. And they wrote a letter in the Financial Times criticizing Israel, criticizing it very much within what one might understand as a Zionist frame of, you know, we love Israel and we're watching its soul being ripped out and we're devastated. And it was very critical of the Netanyahu government's resumption of hostilities in Gaza, and was framing it in the context of there being so much Israeli Jewish opposition to their own prime minister, not least because it was jeopardizing the lives of hostages still in Gaza. And this letter just provoked this very public spat, uncharacteristically public spat amidst British Jewry. They represented 10%, just over 10% of the Board of Deputies. However, the people I've spoken to have said, well, there's easily double that number who would have signed had it not been for fear of doing so, or had they actually known about the letter. And it speaks to the Board of Deputies has been full-throatedly, enthusiastically supportive of Israel. And not only that, but it's been working in the last 18 months or so to get protests, pro-Palestine, solidarity with Gaza, protests banned. It's been, it had a meltdown over the International Criminal Court's pursuit of arrest warrants for a couple of Israeli leaders over war crimes in Gaza. It had a meltdown when the British government issued a partial a ban on arms sales to Israel on the grounds of breaches of humanitarian law. So it's been, very, and it's met with, Israeli ministers from the far right whenever they visit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been very resolutely Israel right or wrong in its approach. And the 36 have been trying internally to raise the idea that actually this is not representative. And the Board of Deputies' response is constantly to say, yes, it is. You guys are fringe. You guys are marginal. You don't count. I'm paraphrasing. They didn't actually say those words. But the thing is that the Rebel 36 are representative when you look at the statistics. So if you look at the latest polling, which was last year, from a sort of independent body that looks at these things, there's almost 30% of British Jews who self-define as non or anti-Zionist. There's 51% in a younger category, I think 16 to 28-year-olds, 51% who do not self-identify as Zionist. And it's worth saying that, of course, many people who self-define as Zionists are horrified by Israel's assault on Gaza and horrified by the Board of Deputies' stance on it. But even if we take just 30% who are self-defining as anti or non-Zionist, that's not a fringe. That's not a minority. That's a political constituency that is not currently being represented by the Board of Deputies. And I think that's what the Rebel 36 were speaking to. That's what they were trying to represent. And the fact that they've been pushed, they've been reprimanded so severely with this denial that they represent anything significant is, of course, part of the problem itself with the Board of Deputies.
Yeah, you've just raised so many issues, and we could probably talk for 4 hours, and we can't. In some respects, what's gone on in the UK parallels the kind of crisis. I think that the split in Australian Jewry, there's another organisation, the Jewish Council of Australia, that's been set up, which is resolutely anti-Zionist, though I do have problems with that word anti-Zionist because I don't actually know what it means in terms of attitudes towards the existence of 6 million or so Jews in Israel and their safety in the future. But anyway, look, I just want to, I'll take a question off the floor. I think I should, and this is to divert a bit. How easy or hard do you think it is for Jews to distinguish between their actual safety and rights and the power and so on that they might have, and the actual reality of their situation? How much does this play into dynamics both with Zionism and non-Zionism? And I'll give a specific example from Australia, which I think you'll understand. There's been some surveys, I call them so-called surveys, of Australian Jewries, of students online and so on. They've all been conducted by the peak organisations. They're actually flawed in their sampling, all sorts of things. And they demonstrate a very high degree of sort of feeling of threat, lack of safety, and so on. But this appears to be, in my view, a confusion between views about Palestine and disturbing views to Jews and the reality of Jewish safety. So how does that just all play in? I'm not sure if I've explained it well, but that sense of lack of safety as a reality and at what point does feeling uncomfortable move across into, you know, actual things are being, you get you being unfriendly to Jews?
Yeah, I think that question, it's a really great question that was posted in the chat. And I think it really gets to the heart of things that we're grappling with in the contemporary conversation. So the first thing to say is that there are two things going on at the same time when it comes to this figures. So it is the case that we have, when you look at the ADL in the US, which actually monitors anti-Semitism, but defines it as essentially anyone critical of Israel, anyone who's an anti-Zionist, and it that's not the case, and it makes it hard to trust the figures. However, when you disaggregate that, so if you look at the UK, for instance, it is a reality that actual anti-Semitism is rising in the UK, and one might extrapolate globally. There have been real instances of anti-Semitism. When you break down the figures in the UK, we are talking about verbal and physical assault. We are talking about, bottles and bricks thrown at buildings and people physically assaulted, and synagogues and Jewish spaces desecrated. And, when you look around the world, we are talking about bomb threats to Jewish schools, and, a full-blown riot in Dagestan, which was unquestionably anti-Semitic. So we have a situation where the real figures are rising. We have main communal groups using criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism and conflating that with real figures, which makes people less likely to believe the real figures. Okay, so that's a situation that progressives who want to tackle all racisms are dealing with. And then at the same time, we do have, as we spoke about earlier, we have this reality where Jewish people in the diaspora have told me about this for the book, were raised in environments where, Israel is seen as part and parcel of their Jewish identity, such that criticism of Israel is experienced as an attack on identity. And we're in an era of identity politics. And so I think the challenge for us is to say, sure, that might be the way you feel, but that's not actually what's happening. Number one, people who are criticizing Israel are not attacking you personally. It's not about your safety. Number two, there's another group of people in this conversation, right? Palestinians, who have to be able to articulate their experiences of Israel, particularly in the current moment, without constantly being accused of anti-Semitism when they do so. And so that's the challenge for us, to be able to say to people, sure, you might be articulating a feeling of, perception that people are attacking you in good faith. You might not be politically mobilizing this. It's still, however, not a valid thing to say, and it's not reasonable thing to say in the current political moment, and that's quite hard. That's our challenge, though.
However, you have a quote in your book from Lydia Polgreen, and she talks about this left-wing echo to the ancestral fantasies of the far right, and that's kind of taking up that issue that Palestinians are seen as indigenous and Jews have no national rights in the Jewish land, in ancient Palestine or Palestine. And so there are elements who see an international Zionist conspiracy at play. And you certainly see that in rhetoric of what I'd call the far left, which is very noisy. So what about that issue of ancestral fantasies on both the left about Palestinians and then the conspiratorial fantasies on the Jewish right, or maybe in the Jewish mainstream, that everyone's out to get us?
So that's an excellent article from Lydia Polgreen, and she interviews some Palestinians in it as well.
I'll put in a plug. So buy Rachel's book. and you can read
Oh yeah,
that
buy the
quote.
book, but also read Lydia Polgreen in the New York Times, who's a wonderful writer. So this gets to the heart of a question that I think, you know, in Australia, obviously, you're going to have more literacy about these issues for obvious reasons. So the reality is of Israel being two things. It's both a national project for Jewish people, and it is just unambiguously for Palestinians a settler colonial project. That's how it was experienced from the start unto this present moment. And to use, you know, Patrick Wolf's definition of settler colonialism, it's ongoing. It's a structure, not an event. And we can see that. We can see the mechanisms of it, both in the catastrophic war on Gaza and in what's happening across the West Bank at the moment. So that's the reality that I think either side cannot engage with fully. And some Palestinians have been engaging with fully. So you look at the Palestinian philosopher, Raif Sreik, who writes a lot in this sphere of settler colonialism. And he talks about how for Europe, they saw Jews as refugees fleeing to Palestine. And for Palestinians, they saw Jews arriving as colonizers. And that's the thing. Both things are true. You know, it is just the reality that for Jews of that period, Palestine was the safe refuge at a time when other countries closed their borders. You know, you look at what the UK did, you look at what the US did, actually shut their borders at that moment precisely and specifically so there wouldn't be an influx of Jewish refugees. So there's that on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was a colonial project. You know, the Zionist leaders of the time talked about it in those terms. They knew Palestinians would react to Jewish arrivals with the intention of creating a homeland. They knew they would oppose it because every peoples would oppose it and have done historically. And when you look at the ethnic cleansing and the violence and the dispossession and the occupation and you know, a system described as apartheid by experts in apartheid, you can see that unambiguously that's the experience for Palestinians. And so the challenge is to hold those two things at the same time, and what we do with that in terms of outcomes for that region, for all the people, for everyone who lives in that region. The other thing
I'd like to take. Oh, go on.
Go on.
No.
Just briefly about the idea of conspiratorialism, which you do see on the left now in response to Israel. One might say that it's hardly a surprise that we arrive in that place in an environment where there's low literacy about anti-Semitism and what it looks like, and the fact that it is a conspiracy of power, in a reality where for 18 months we've had Western leaders support Israel, enable, give cover, fund all these atrocities. We have Joe Biden, the most powerful man in the world, saying, well, I tried to stop Netanyahu, but I couldn't. And so what are people supposed to think of that? You know, if that's the way it's being presented, as nobody can stop Israel, then of course that's going to feed conspiratorial theories. And I think, again, that's a left gap in the way we talk about, or the way you see people talk about the issue, which is to completely disappear the geopolitical reality of that, which is that Western allies are supporting Israel because of, you know, military, strategic, security, intel reasons.
Yeah, and certainly Israel is
foreign policy of the West, right? But that's not the perception that we get in the way that we talk about it.
Yeah, and Israel is seen as the linchpin, if that's the word, of the global empire. It is the place, and there are advocates who say if we take care of Palestine, the world will change. Like everything will change. There'll be a new dawn. Anyway, that's just another point. You've raised something which I think relates to the IHRA, which everyone here knows about, I think, or if they don't. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance alliance, which the short introductory words to it about the nature of anti-Semitism aren't particularly objectionable, but the examples it uses have a lot of problems with them. And this alliance statement's been used as a club against higher education in particular, particularly in the United States, where dreadful things are happening. I've just been there, and in Australia. But one of the points in it is that they claim that opposing Israel as a state is not acceptable. Calling it a racist state is no good. But the point I want to raise about Zionism is, which I'm confused about, is opposition to a Jewish national project, and that's your frame, on the grounds that is collectively inevitably racist, anti-Semitic. So I'm distinguishing between Jews as a collective group and a state. So is opposing a state a racist thing? And where do you draw the lines between it being a communally racist state or something that is inevitably racist?
So I think part of the problem here is that we're collapsing a few things. There are things that are anti-Semitic, and there are things that potentially are not anti-Semitic, but are definitely unstrategic and unhelpful if you're trying to build a broad, progressive movement that can push back against all these things. So is calling Israel a racist state, or is questioning the validity of Israel as a national project anti-Semitic? Only if you've singled out Israel. Only if you're saying, well, Jews can't have a national homeland, but all the other minorities who are trying to pursue one, Kurds, Palestinians, Basques, Catalans, all of them, that's fine. It's just the Jews that can't have one, right? Then I would go, what is it about your concept of nationalisms that excludes a Jewish collective, right? I'd have questions about that.
Rachel, so is that where you say that the statement Judaism and Zionism are not the same thing is fatally flawed, that it's not understanding that it's not just a religion? Because we hear that statement that we're not opposed to Jews as a religion, we're opposed to the state of Israel. But does that also mean opposition to Jews as a national collective that has the same sort of rights and identity as other groups, as Ukrainians, as Kurds, as others who didn't have a homeland?
I mean, I personally would prefer it if we never talked about Zionism again, because I think it's a profoundly unhelpful label in this context, because it means such dramatically different things to different people. It's actually non-usable. I don't know what people mean when they say they're a Zionist or they're opposed to Zionists or to Zionism. And I think a much more useful way of building progressive movements is not litmus testing people on their Zionism or not, but asking them actually what their politics are. What do you think about the Israeli government? What do you think about the military occupation? How would you define what's happening? The politics of the region and whether we oppose them or not are far more telling indicators of our solidarity or not. So I think that's the first thing I would say.
That's a really good word you've just used, solidarity. And I want to ask you about this, because there are those on the left who referred to the Bund and the history of socialism, Durchheit or Deutschheit, existence in your national homeland. And it appears to me that some wish for a total fracture between the 6 million Jews of Israel, or 7 million Jews of Israel, and the rest of the Jews in the diaspora. And that seems to be the case in the States, that there is a bit of a movement saying, no, we are Jews in the diaspora. We have no relationship, and we need not have one to this fascist state.
Look,
And
I
we
think
do not
that
express any solidarity with them.
I think
Solidarity
that
in the sense of joint struggle.
there's lots of manifestations of politics of Jews in the diaspora. What I would say, though, is that I think it's important that we acknowledge that for the state of Israel, it does not matter either way. They've said as much. We've had a former Israeli ambassador to the US, Ron Derner, giving an interview a few years ago, and he was talking about, look, Christian Zionists are far more important to us. There's more of them. There's millions more Christian Zionists than ever there are Jews in the diaspora. And for the Jews in the diaspora who oppose the policies of Israel, all that happens is that we have our identity as Jews stripped, because Jewish, for them, has become an ideology rather than identity. So I think it's important to de-center the Jewish diaspora in this conversation. Ultimately, it really doesn't matter either way. This is not where the state of Israel is drawing its support. It's not where it's drawing its political and diplomatic cover. That relationship might be important to Jews in the diaspora, but it's becoming less important to the Israeli state.
So do you think that the Israeli state, with its relationships with India, which is quite important now, China, which has been, other non-democracies or limited democracies, is more important than any relationship that it has with the rest of the Jews in the world? And that so-called relationship is just a fiction for an authoritarian military state, which is something others on the left claim?
So
or am I going too far?
I have two chapters in my book looking at the far right, which I think is the bit that we often miss in this equation, which is that for several decades, primarily because it's been happening in a European context. So primarily over the last couple of decades with Benjamin Netanyahu's government, there has been a strategic win-win alliance with the far right across Europe. So whether that's Viktor Orban in Hungary, whether it's Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, whether it's the French Marine Le Pen, the Netanyahu far right has clocked that with support for Israel waning following the collapse of the peace process and the beginning of the Second Intifada, and Israeli settlements expansion and Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and the beginning of the separation wall, claimed illegal by The Hague, but Israel went ahead and built it. With all of those things rising, the EU was becoming more and more critical. Netanyahu looked at all the new nations from Eastern Europe and the Visegrad bloc joining the EU, and decided to cultivate relationships with those countries. For those countries, and this is what has become a defining theme of far-right politics across the world, particularly in the US. For the far right, they saw rehabilitation in that equation. If we cultivate relationships with Israel, we can then say, how can we possibly be anti-Semitic? Here's a picture of Orban hugging Netanyahu. Of course, we're not anti-Semites. We love Israel. And that has been key to their political rehabilitation. They have been able to reestablish themselves as a political force and focus on their main current ideology, which is hating on Muslims and hating on migrants, and use the proclaimed defense of Jewish people as a way to do that. And so when we look at what the US is doing now, we can say, sure, some particularly strident and vocal organizations like the ADL and APAC and others have been mobilizing for this conflation. But actually, the people who are making political hay with it right now do not care about Israel and Jewish people either way. It is just instrumental for their own political purposes. And it's gone way beyond shutting down criticism of Israel. It has extended into their fight against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. They've attacked Black Lives Matter with it. They're attacking the entire edifice of liberal universities with it because they've found themselves in the fight against anti-Semitism, the perfect wedge, the perfect tool with which to disrupt politics and further their own political goals. And I think the more we engage with that, the more we're going to be able to push back and fight against it.
What about the emergence of what I'd call the conservative Jewish right, or the conservative Jews, which might be in the board of deputies, certainly in the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and elsewhere, who seem to have found it convenient to build some alliances or not yell and scream about the far right. Do you think they are conscious of what they're playing with? That they're playing fire, or like a fanatical anti-communist back in the 50s, they just close their eyes to the evil around us?
I don't know what's going on in their minds, but what I can talk about and what I talk about in the book is that part of the fact that they have any traction at all, the fact that these Jewish communal bodies have been veering towards these alliances with the far right, and that has any traction at all, speaks to a vacuum created by the progressive left over anti-Semitism. The reality is that the only people who are talking substantively about anti-Semitism at the moment, and the need to fight it, is the right wing. And everything they say about it is horrendous, right? Everything they say about it is, well, it's coming from Muslims, it's coming from migrants, we need to shut down free speech, we need to police these marches, we need to excessively police the streets and Jewish organizations. Everything they say about it is awful, but they're saying something about it. And the progressive left is not saying anything other than these claims of anti-Semitism are being used to silence criticism of Israel, which is true, and which is having horrendous consequences in real material terms. But it can't be the only thing that we say about it. And so for me, the question is not why these Jewish communal bodies are doing what they're doing, because we can't control that. But what we can control is what the progressive left does. And I think part of the thing that we need to do is to reclaim that fight against anti-Semitism, to treat it seriously, to engage with it seriously, because you cannot bat off politicized claims of anti-Semitism unless you engage with the reality of actual anti-Semitism. They're both part and parcel of the same struggle.
So that gets on to the anti-racism strategy, and I realise we've only got about a quarter of an hour or so left, but a question has come in from the floor, and I'll ask that one first, and then can we go on to talking about an anti-racism strategy which takes up those issues that you've been discussing. So do you see a point with the struggle for decolonisation in Israel, Palestine moves to a one person, one vote, like the ANC is written here, I suppose, like in South Africa, rather than a nation-state struggle, which ties into some of the idealistic ideas on the left in particular about what should or what must emerge. Have you got any view about what might happen in the future in Israel, Palestine, or is that all too hard?
Well, I think that that's already happened. So if you look at the prominent strain within Palestine solidarity movements globally, the prominent strain is one state. It's a one-state solution for a secular liberal state where everyone has equal rights. So it's already shifted into that sphere. And part of the reason that it shifted into that sphere is the absolute collapse on the ground of the possibility of any viable Palestinian state, because Jewish settlements have so encroached the region of occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank, such as to make a Palestinian state now physically on the ground impossible, alongside the sort of political diplomatic collapse of pressure for a two-state solution. So the question then becomes, given that that's the conversation prominently amongst the Palestine solidarity movement, is what then becomes of the fact that there now is a Jewish collective in the area of Israel with the characteristics of a nation. There is now a nation that is a collective of Jews. So what do you do with that? And so I think when we look at a solution, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's going to look like, particularly now after Gaza, after the destruction of Gaza. But we can see that it has to have certain things as a feature of it. The recognition of the collectives that exist there at the moment, Palestinians and Israeli Jews, has to be a part of that, alongside essentially dismantling structures where Jewish people have privilege and more rights than Palestinians in that region. So there has to be equity, there has to be a system of justice. Personally, I think you don't get anywhere without a process of reconciliation. But getting to that stage is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we're facing today, of getting Israeli Jews to the process of understanding that that needs to happen.
We could spend all day on this, but we can't. So I'm going to turn to the next question that was lined up, which was about developing an inclusive anti-racism strategy on the left that includes the concerns of Jews and anti-Semitism. I suppose one that doesn't lead to rejection of Jewish concerns. Can you talk about that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, it was the question about the development of an inclusive anti-racism strategy that takes up the concerns of Jews.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the question. That's what we're sitting with now. And one of the things that, you know, when I wrote the book, one of the things that came up is when you look at the history of racism, including anti-Semitism, it becomes very clear that they're all part of, you know, that different forms of racism used at different times against different people for different reasons. But the origin story in all of this is Christian Europe, right? You've got Christian Europeans historically targeting different groups and persecuting different groups for different reasons. And actually, they're constantly borrowing from one racism in order to uphold the other. So when you look at the story of Jews in the medieval period in Christian Europe, and the way that they were othered and persecuted, one of the ways that they were othered, particularly in southern Spain, in the 1490s, after Spain reconquered Al-Andalus from Islamic rule, one of the ways that it did that was to look at purity of blood. You know, there's this concept of, well, you know, even Jews who've converted to Christianity, they don't have pure blood. Therefore, we have to treat them differently. They can't have the same rights as regular people, meaning Christian Europeans. So that idea of the purity of blood, you then see it travel across to the Americas, where it was used to underpin and inform the racism that justified colonization and enslavement of people and perpetuated for hundreds of years. And then you jump forward and you look at, you know, Hitler and the Third Reich, when he was looking at a way to discriminate against Jewish people. He actually looked at the Jim Crow rules in the US, which were essentially a way of upholding white supremacy after the collapse of slavery. And he thought about using that system to persecute Jewish people. So you can see they're bouncing between each other all the time historically. And it's always Christian Europeans who are at the racism committees, if you like, deciding who and how to persecute for the purposes of upholding their own power and wealth and colonies and so on. And once you understand that, it just becomes completely pointless to be fighting these different racisms in silos, right? It makes no sense whatsoever to be fighting them vertically, which is what Jewish communal bodies have been doing. You know, they've been making appeals to the state to fight anti-Semitism, rather than what was historically the case, where we would fight all of these things together because we understood that they're interconnected. And I think we just need to get back to that moment where people understood that fighting racisms in the silos created by racism makes no sense. And the only way we can push back against all these intersecting racisms is to do so collectively and to re-tether the struggle against anti-Semitism back into the wider struggle against anti-racism, against racism.
What, and should that happen through schools, through social media? I mean, the media, and you've got Murdoch and his agenda, and certainly in Australia, he's in control of a lot, really nasty stuff. I mean, what do you see as a major uh, means of achieving this?
Well, the book is not a policy document. The book is
No.
for progressive movements, and the hope is to inspire and mobilize a different way of thinking about this that increases solidarity rather than increases the division. And it's hard precisely because of what you say, because the mainstream conversation is actually producing divisions. It's producing the perception of a hierarchy, because we have Western political leaders talk about anti-Semitism all the time, not helpfully, I may add, not in a way that promotes understanding of anti-Semitism at all, mostly to shut down criticism of Israel. But because that's the racism that they talk about, there is this perception of a hierarchy. And so we are operating in an environment where everything is pushing at division rather than solidarity. And so that's our challenge, is how to operate within these spaces. But what I can say is that in the process of writing the book, I was in contact with so many different people, organizations, academics, solidarity groups globally who are doing this work right now. And they may be doing it in a disjointed way. It's not like a global movement, but it's definitely happening. And so there is, I think, hope in the knowledge that there are so many people currently engaged in the task of presenting something different, a different way to tackle anti-Semitism in a way that is actually congruent with our politics and is morally coherent and builds with the struggle for Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian liberation rather than working against it.
I'd like to ask somebody from the floor to ask a question that's more related to this kind of area. Has anyone got a question? You can turn on the mic. So it's really the first one who turns the mic on can ask a question. There must be someone. Anyone? Well, I'm going to ask Carol to ask a question. Oh, sorry, Bonnie can ask a question. Turn on your mic, Bonnie. Bonnie, turn on your microphone.
Unmute. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Rachel. It's been very interesting. Rachel, what would you... I'm constantly surprised by what some of us call the fetishization of Israel-Palestine, that there are horrible conflicts going on in the world that are largely ignored by the left. And the people where there are stands outside cinemas and there are keffiyehs and stickers and things, there's nothing for for us to show support for other conflicts. Do you see that as just anti-Semitism, ignorance? How would you describe that?
No, I don't think I think it's really hard because we have to untangle so many different things that are going on in that equation. And we are in a we all live in societies where anti-Semitism is just it's like a deep reservoir, It's historical, and it's primarily in the European context, it's about Jews being othered. And it's about, how Europeans saw Jews was much more about their own identity. It was about the identity of Christian Europeans, right? So Jews became a mechanism by which Christian Europeans could understand themselves. Okay, and so that's a motif. Brian Klug, the philosopher, the British Jewish philosopher Brian Klug, writes about this beautifully, of the sort of relationship that Jewry has with Europe, and so that's a default ambient thing. But at the same time, I'm not surprised that there is a focus on Palestine. It's the longest running military occupation, and it's currently, we're looking at currently a war that experts in genocide describe as genocidal, and even if we don't describe it as that, we are looking at a reality where 17,000 kids have been killed.
I wasn't downplaying the numbers. I wasn't trivializing. Yep.
No, I don't think you were. I'm just explaining the context. I don't think you were at all. I'm just explaining the context for people who, as you say, are showing up more in solidarity with that conflict. And in the book, I try and look at the reasons why. And so I'm cycling through some of them now. So it's a protracted, long-running conflict. It's also one that, Western allies are part of the equation. It's not for nothing that Palestinians call it an American-Israeli war. They see it as absolutely driven by, funded, the weapons, the diplomatic cover, by Americans through their client state of Israel. And so, of course, people in those Western countries that are supporting Israel are going to have more of a concern with that, or protest against it more visibly than they would against someone who's not an ally of Britain, say Syria, right? So I think those things all are part of the equation. And what I would add is that I don't think it's ipso facto true that that's the case. So I see a lot of organizations and a lot of campaigners that I know are constantly talking about Yemen, for instance, currently. And the famine in Yemen, the horrendous humanitarian cost in Yemen. There's a whole constituency of the left that really called out the Palestine Solidarity left for being so terrible on Syria, for not speaking up against it. There were some strains that were very visibly pro-Assad. So that is a very ongoing and live conversation. So I would slightly disrupt the assumption that people who care about Palestine don't care about anything else, because we can see them speaking up and campaigning across other issues, including currently Yemen.
Thank you very much.
Okay, as a white male of a certain age, how does gender play into what's going on at the moment in terms of both anti-Semitism, fighting anti-Semitism, leadership, and so on? I ask this because I see increasingly in the world, in the political world, the emergence of younger women, and some are very take quite radical positions on matters. But did you see the emergence of the new women-led leadership to bring about change in the UK amongst Jews there?
I think, what we're looking at when we look at the Middle East more widely, when we look at the Israel-Palestine situation, it is quite male-dominated, and it has been for some time. And we are seeing a change now, particularly with the younger generation. And I do think, and certainly this came across when I was interviewing for the people for the book, one of the things that has given people hope in this moment is the work of what is often a younger demographic, but not always, right? So the Palestine solidarity marches here are across demographics. There's different generations at those protests, but the sight of there's this young Jewish demographic that has fallen away from mainstream communal Jewish groups because they do not see themselves or their values reflected there. And that's on the communal groups, by the way, for being so in lockstep with Israel, right or wrong. So you see them actually try and reaffirm their own Jewish identity and values in a way that is congruent with Palestine solidarity, Palestine liberation, and also, as Brenda has put in the chat, is premised on human rights, is premised on humanitarian law, is premised on international law, is premised on values around equity and justice that flow through progressive understanding across other issues. And so I think a lot of people have been really heartened when they see things in the US, and there's plenty of women leading these movements, and they see things in the US where there's Jewish, there's like a Friday night prayers at the solidarity encampments. There's Passover texts that are very much progressive and inclusive and speaking about Gaza. This idea that Jewish people are claiming a Jewish identity that isn't bound up with blindly loyal support for Israel no matter what, I think is really encouraging and is giving people a lot of hope.
Rachel, you work for The Guardian in the UK, yes?
I freelance for them, yes.
Would there be a possibility of getting The Guardian to send you to Australia for a while to speak here?
Unfortunately not, but I am working on, thank you so much for saying that. I am working on trying to come and speak. Unfortunately, I wasn't, the book wasn't selected to be part of either festival in Sydney or Melbourne. But I am very much hoping to come out to Australia and meet with everyone and discuss the book and just engage with the sort of issues that you're talking about so carefully and grappling with. It would be a real pleasure to have these conversations in person.
Would be great if you could come.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. That's really
Thank
nice.
you. Now, Rachel, have you got any final remarks? Because it is about an hour. It'd be great if you could offer any final thoughts or reflections. Yeah. And I forgot actually the right of return, which I think is a fundamental issue for Palestinians, and it goes to the core of the conflict, in fact, about who owns the land. Have you got any views about that in the future?
I'm going to, that's probably going to take up more time than we have, but in terms of just final comments, I would just say, and this is the experience of, having thought about these issues for a while, pretty much since the Corbyn era, and thinking about them through the book and, trying to talk with a lot of people about these issues. It's really hard, right? It's really hard because we're actually trying to force open a space that doesn't currently exist, or at the moment is very, very narrow. It's really hard to have this conversation in the current political and media environment, because there's so many forces that are trying to close it. And actually sometimes, primarily those forces are coming from the right, and the insistence of, Palestine solidarity marches are anti-Semitic, the BBC is anti-Semitic, Swedish climate campaigners are anti-Semitic. That kind of conversation is making it very difficult to propose an alternative. And sometimes, the conspiracism that we see in the left and the reluctance to engage with the reality of anti-Semitism is another force. And so it's just really, really hard to have this conversation. But what I can say is that, touring and talking about the book over the last few months, I can see there is such an appetite for this conversation. So many progressive people actually do. They do care about solidarity with Jewish people, and they want to find a way to talk about that alongside their solidarity with Palestinians and their horrors at what's going on in Gaza. I think there's just a silent majority at the moment. There's very noisy people shouting about this issue, but there's actually a silent majority that does care and does want to have this conversation. And so even though it is really difficult, we do need to just keep forcing, claiming this space, because there's definitely an appetite for it and people who want this conversation to be had.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to ask Harold, and I hadn't asked him, but Harold's very good at summarizing things and doing the thank yous. So I might ask him to do that.
I'm happy to do
Poor
that.
Harold, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask Brenda whether she would like to do that sort of summary. Would you be comfortable, Brenda?
I'm not sure if I can give a complete summary because it's been so rich.
Thanks, Brenda.
But I think I do want to say that I think it's incredibly important work that we absolutely do need to unpack the issues. I think there's probably a diversity of views amongst the people in the Zoom meeting, but it's probably a common experience that the sense of Jewish identity, which you reference also, has been so exploded, I think, over the last 18 months or whatever in particular. And those of us here who've been seeking to bring forward another way of thinking about it have been really struggling to find a space where these kinds of issues can be thought about in depth. So I think, so I really, your book is incredibly timely. And I agree with Robin that it'd be lovely to have you out here to help us pursue those conversations further. So thank you. And thank you to AJDS and Larry as well, because I really appreciate the thoughtful questioning and being able to pursue as much as we can in an hour in some depth the really critical issues. So thank you from my perspective. Yes.
Thank you, Brenda. That was very good, and it sort of summed up my feeling as well about this idea of exploding the issue into something that's much wider than we often focus on ourselves. We tend to do that siloing that Rachel referred to. Thank you.
Just to say thank you so much for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you all. And I really hear what you're saying, Brenda, about the difficulties. And just, I think just to keep up the amazing work that you're all doing, despite the difficulties you are, it is incredible what you're managing to do. So keep it going and hopefully see you in person very soon.
And thank you to everyone who took part today.
Yeah, and we should talk about that tour as well, but that's another issue.
Another conversation.
Thank you for your time on a Sunday morning in the UK. So I invite you to come with me out to the piazza just downstairs and come and have some coffee with me and
That's great.
some nice dolce. I'm sorry.
Thank
you very much for
your at the moment.
Everyone's time.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.